Good evening, visitors. Good evening, visitors. Welcome to the Australian War Memorial's last post ceremony. My name is Gerard Pratt, and joining us today from the Royal Australian Navy is Lieutenant Commander Josh Clifford. This evening, we commemorate the 76th anniversary of the loss of the Australian light cruiser HMAS Perth and more than 350 members of her crew in the Battle of the Sunda Strait on this date in 1942. The bell that you heard being struck was recovered in 1975 from the wreckage of HMAS Perth 1. On the 28th of February, HMAS Perth and the heavy cruiser USS Houston were making for the southern coast of Java. Late that evening, they encountered the Japanese Western invasion convoy at the northern entrance to the Sunda Strait. The convoy was escorted by a large Japanese flotilla of 2 light cruisers, 8 destroyers and a mine layer, supported by another 4 cruisers, an aircraft carrier and further destroyers. Heavily outnumbered and soon running low on ammunition, the changing course constantly to avoid attacks from every direction, the Australian and American crews fought desperately against impossible odds. Together, Perth and Houston succeeded in sinking a Japanese transport and mine layer, and they severely damaged a further 3 transports. But under the weight of Japanese numbers and superior firepower, the end was inevitable. Japanese ships launched 85 torpedoes during the brief engagement. Perth suffered her first hit from a Japanese shell at 11:26 p.m. Soon after midnight, the first torpedo struck. With her crew reduced to firing practice shells and illumination star shells, when a second torpedo hit, Perth, shortly afterwards, her captain ordered, "Abandon ship." Perth was hit by 2 more torpedoes before finally sinking at 25 minutes after midnight on the 1st of March. The action was all over in just under an hour from the time the first round struck. Houston, meantime, continued to fight. Although ablaze from enemy fire, she was rent by shell and torpedo explosions and sank just 20 minutes later. The captains of both vessels perished with their ships. Of the complement of 686 men in HMAS Perth, more than half, over 350 officers and ratings, perished in this, her last action. Of the 320 survivors captured by the Japanese, 1/3 died during their long ordeal as prisoners of war. Of the more than 1,000 American officers and men in USS Houston, less than 400 escaped their sinking ship. Only 266 of them survived the harsh regime of brutality and starvation in Japanese prisoner of war camps. Australian sailors would undoubtedly wish us to remember their brave American comrades today too. Together, we remember the brave sailors of both vessels, as well as those on other Allied warships, Australian, British, American and Dutch sailors who were lost in the series of engagements in the Java Sea while attempting to repel large Japanese invasion forces. Here this evening, we will tell the story of just one of those Australian sailors. We are honoured to acknowledge representatives who are here specifically to commemorate the anniversary of the loss of HMAS Perth and USS Houston. Commodore Michelle Miller, former commanding officer of HMAS Perth 3, representing the Chief of Navy. Captain Tony DeFreitas, US Naval Attaché. Mr. Peter Everly, President, HMAS Perth Association, ACT Area. Mr Jack Aaron, Naval Association of Australia, ACT area. Mr John King, President, ACT branch, Returned Services League Association of Australia. Mr Hilton Leonard, Secretary, 107th Battery Association, and representatives from the Canberra Girls Grammar School. Also today in attendance are representatives from the Australian Defence Force, Australian Rules Association and the Richmond Football Club. Major General Rick Burr, Deputy Chief of Army, and Mr Brendan Gale, Chief Executive Officer, Richmond Football Club. We welcome the veterans who have served, those that are still serving, and the families that support them. Today, we especially wish to convey our sympathies to the family of Mr David Manning. David passed away on the 21st of February. He was the last Victorian survivor of the tragedy. Mr Frank McGovern is now the sole HMAS Perth 1 survivor. Unfortunately, Mr McGovern could not be here with us tonight, but we understand that he may be watching from home today. We acknowledge the members of RSL and Services Clubs Association, RSL Victoria and RSL Queensland who are watching the broadcast of this ceremony from across Australia. During the ceremony, wreaths will be laid at the base of the Pool of Reflection by students on behalf of the following schools: from Tasmania, Circular Head Christian School, Smithen. Australia's Federation Guard is the tri-service ceremonial unit of the Australian Defence Force. They provide a ceremonial presence at civil and military events and during visits to Australia by foreign dignitaries. The Guard will now dismount the catapult party from the tomb of the unknown Australian soldier. invite you all to please stand and join in singing the national anthem.
Catapult party, attention! Catapult party, present arms.
Australians, all let us rejoice, for we are young and free. We've golden soil and wealth for toil, our home is earth by sea. Our land abounds in nature's gifts of beauty rich and rare. In history's page let every state advance Australia fair. In joyous strains then let us sing, advance Australia fair.
Catapult party, shoulder arms.
If you're able, please be seated. The Australian War Memorial was the vision of Charles Bean, Australia's First World War official historian. Bean landed with the Australian troops on Gallipoli and stayed with them at the front through until the end of the war. The idea of this national memorial and museum came to him at Pozières, France, in the depths of the bloody fighting of 1916. Bean's idea was that this would be a place where families and friends could mourn loved ones buried in faraway places. It would also be a place that could help all Australians understand what these men and women had endured and what they had done for us. Bean's vision, to which we remain true, is best expressed as inscribed in the entrance to the memorial's galleries. Here is their spirit, in the heart of the land they loved, and here we guard the record which they themselves made. Tonight we will read the story behind just one of those on the Roll of Honour, which lists the names of more than 102,000 men and women who have given their lives for us in war and operations for more than a century. But first, we present a lament, Flowers of the Forest. Wreaths or floral tributes will now be laid at the base of the pool of reflection.
Today, we remember and pay tribute to leading seaman Frank Dandridge Johnson. Frank Johnson was born on the 1st of July 1921 to Wilfred and Irene Johnson of Waverley, New South Wales. He enlisted in the Royal Australian Navy at the age of 17 and began service at HMAS Cerberus, a training facility on the Mornington Peninsula in Victoria. After a period of service on the destroyer HMAS Waterhen, Johnson was serving aboard the heavy cruiser HMAS Canberra when Australia's involvement in the Second World War was announced in September 1939. He was a member of Canberra's crew when it escorted the first convoy carrying troops of the 2nd AIF and 2nd New Zealand Expeditionary Force to the Middle East. In August 1940, Johnson returned to the Cerberus and a few months later was deployed to serve on the light cruiser HMAS Perth. After patrolling and escort duties in Australian waters, in November 1940, just after Johnson joined the crew, Perth departed for the Mediterranean. There she took part in the Battle of Cape Matapan and the evacuation of Greece and Crete in April and May of 1941. During the course of these actions, Perth was badly damaged by enemy bombing. After repairs, the cruiser was engaged in operations off the coast of Syria before proceeding to Australia for an extended refit, arriving in Sydney in August. In mid-February 1942, Perth sailed for the Netherlands East Indies. During the 27th and 28th of February, the Perth fought in the major naval battle for the Java Sea amongst a force of Australian, British, Dutch, and American ships. 5 of the 14 Allied ships that took part in the action were lost against a formidable Japanese force. HMAS Perth and USS Houston were lucky to survive. They were able to break off from the engagement and make for Tanjung Priok to refuel. The following night, HMAS Perth and USS Houston made for the southern coast of Java through the Sunda Strait. En route, they bravely engaged a Japanese invasion force heading for Java. In the ensuing battle for Sunda Strait, the heavily outnumbered ships were sunk. 357 members of Perth's crew were killed when the ship went down. Frank Johnson survived and was one of 320 crew members of Perth who became prisoners of the Japanese. He was first imprisoned on Java, where he spent much of 1942. Towards the end of the year, he left Java as part of a large work party bound for Burma and Thailand. His party joined a much larger workforce of prisoner of war labour used by the Japanese to construct the Thai-Burma Railway. Many of the prisoners working on the railway were malnourished and disease was rife. Johnson survived 18 months on the railway and after its completion was transported from Thailand to Singapore. Here, along with more than 2,000 Australian and British prisoners of war, he embarked upon the ship Rakio Maru, which, along with the Kashidoki Maru, was to transport the prisoners to Japan. On the morning of the 12th of September 1944, the convoy was attacked by American submarines in the South China Sea, unaware that Allied prisoners were being transported in the holds of the cargo ship. Rakio Maru, with 1,318 Australian and British prisoners of war aboard, was sunk by USS Sea Lion II. Kashidoki Maru, carrying 900 British prisoners of war, was sunk by USS Pampanito. The prisoners who were able to evacuate the ships spent the following days in life rafts or clinging to wreckage in open water. About 150 Australian and British survivors were rescued by American submarines. A further 500 were picked up by Japanese destroyers and continued their journey to Japan. Those who were not rescued perished at sea. 1,559 Australian and British prisoners of war were killed in the incident, all missing at sea. Among the missing was leading seaman Frank Johnson. He was 23 years old. Today, he is commemorated at the Plymouth Naval Memorial in Britain, which is dedicated to the thousands of British and Commonwealth sailors who lost their lives at sea or who have no known grave. His name is listed here on the Roll of Honour on my left, among almost 40,000 Australians who died while serving in the Second World War. His photograph is displayed beside the pool of reflection. This is but one of the many stories of service and sacrifice told here at the Australian War Memorial. we now remember leading seaman Frank Dandridge Johnson, who gave his life for us, for our freedoms, and in the hope of a better world.
Please stand for the reading of the ode and the sounding of the last post.
They have no grave but the cruel sea. No flowers lay at their head. A rusting hulk is their tombstone, a fast on the ocean bed. They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them.
We will remember them.
Catapult party, present, arms. Catapult party, shoulder, arms.
Lest we forget.
Lest we forget.
Catapult party, outwards, turn, quick, march.
We leave you this evening with the words of the memorial's founder, Charles Bean. Many a man lying out there at Pozières, or in the low scrub at Gallipoli, with his poor, tired senses barely working through the fever of his brain, has thought in his last moments, well, it's over. But in Australia, they will be proud of this. Ladies and gentlemen, girls and boys, that concludes the last post ceremony. We thank you all for visiting the Australian War Memorial and wish you all a very good evening. Thank you.